Zetkin and World War One. I was asked just before the session how I'm going to avoid repetition with repeating Mario Kessler's talk this morning, but don't worry, there'll be lots of different and indeed new material hot off the press. I had the fortune of spending last week in the German SPD. Well, SPD, you have to kind of spit when you go in. It's the Ebert archive, British Ebert, digging through a load of material related to Zetkin and World War One. So there will be hopefully a lot of stuff that's new for you today. And I should say that I'm still working through some of the stuff that I've dug up and everything. So this is very much a kind of ongoing work in progress, but it's bearing some nice fruit, and hopefully you'll be able to partake of that as well. Let's get started. The state of research. So this is a letter from Zetkin written in 1932, and basically I think it's important to state at the very outset of this talk that Zetkin is significant in a number of ways when it comes to the struggle for principled politics against the war in 1914 through to the German Revolution of 1918. We heard a lot from Mario this morning about Luxembourg and Liebknecht, and indeed those are kind of the two names that you'll hear in this regard in terms of the Spartacus group and its activities, etc. But there were others, and it should be said that Zetkin is significant insofar as she had, as we'll see, a real social base to call upon, not just in Germany, but within the international movement to rally the forces that were confused, demoralized, defeated after the betrayal of August 1914, and is therefore in a position, a unique position, actually, I would argue, to not only proceed with that project, but she occupies a unique position in the transition, if you like, from the Second International to the Third, insofar as she was a leading member, one of the few leading members of both, insofar as she was the international secretary of the International Socialist Women's Movement in the Second International, then became the president of the women's section of Comintern and Third International. I imagine that with a few exceptions, maybe kind of reminiscences of Lenin, Krupskaya, and other secondary sources, you probably won't, even though you probably, most of you here, you'll know about Zetkin, you know that she was involved in the Spartacus group, you might actually not be fully aware of what she did, what she was up to, what her activities were, what she was writing, who she was writing to, and that's kind of the plan today. I put this letter up just to give an illustration of the fact that until very recently, it has been difficult to ascertain what Zetkin did during the First World War because, well, a number of factors, but the main one being that her letters, her correspondence, was kind of sat upon, unfortunately, by the GDR, the SED ruling party of the GDR. And historians produce a lot of material on Zetkin, far more actually than in the West. She was kind of lionized in the East, as I spoke about in the previous talk. But anything close, anything critical, or anything that might slightly put her at odds with Lenin and the Bolsheviks or the Russian Revolution was just sat upon or even censored, as we'll see later on in this talk. And that's meant that it's been very difficult to see, if we're looking at 1914, 1918, what she was doing and what she was about. The archives opened in the early 1990s, so we've had some historians go into the archives in Berlin and access this stuff. I'm fortunate that I'm able to read and speak German, but that is pretty tricky for me, unless I have a lot of help from my German friends to kind of decipher. This is an die Zentrale der KPD. You can just about work that out, but it's very tricky to work through these things. Fortunately, and this is a recent thing, there's a project by a historian called Marga Vogt, who is, she's a Russianist, but she works in all of the archives where Zetkin's letters can be found. So Berlin, the Kautsky archive in Amsterdam, because, who would have thought it? There's an enormous correspondence between the Kautskys and Zetkin from the early years. A nice letter we'll refer to later on, that's not to Carl, but we'll come back to that. And this is an ongoing project. This is Band 1, so volume 1 of Zetkin's correspondence. This is the war years, 1914 to 1918. So you can actually have it in readable, legible text, and that's been a real service. It's a wonderful book, and it should hopefully one day make it into English, because it provides a much more differentiated view of Zetkin, the contradictions in her reactions and her approach to World War I, the limitations, the weaknesses, the strengths, where she differed with other comrades, etc., which until, as I said, until very recently was kind of sat upon as a bit risque or potentially posing a threat to or undermining the GDR state narrative of Zetkin as this, this wonderful leader who stood for everything that the Soviet Union stood for, the GDR, and blah blah blah. Right. So that's, I think, worth pointing out at the top of it. The question of, was she a puppet of the Bolsheviks? We will come back to that. And yes, and in the course of things as well, I've gone away and not just looked at a correspondence, but I've also been able to get hold of this publication, which is, we'll talk about it later on, Die Frauenbeilager der Leipziger Volkszeit, and we actually have some comrades here from Leipzig, kind of the hotspot of German working class history. And I'll come on to talk about that later, but yeah, there's 37 volumes of that now in my bedroom for me to work through at some point, my office, I should say. Yeah, so just winding the clock back slightly, this may be familiar to you, and if it's not familiar to you, I'll do a thing to YouTube. I gave a talk maybe a couple of months ago on Zetkin's women's publication, Die Gleichheit, which would be worth looking at. But the main point I would make is that Die Gleichheit was not a magazine of so-called women's issues. It was a magazine, a theoretical journal to address women that were becoming active in the workers' movement, to get them involved into work in the workers' movement, to train them. But also it was and crucially, importantly, it was an organ of the left wing of German social democracy, the radical wing of social democracy. So one of the consistent features of Zetkin's work is an emphasis on imperialism, colonialism, naval bills, arms expenditure, etc., in the run-up to long before the outbreak of war in 1914, polemics against Reichstag deputies that are kind of wavering on this question, calling them to account, etc., fighting the revisionist wing of social democracy, implying somehow that imperialism has a progressive or civilizing role to play potentially. Very strong on that consistently throughout. As I alluded to before, in 1907, Die Gleichheit, the Equality, the newspaper for the interests of women workers, that becomes the official publication of the International Socialist Women's Movement. That's a meeting of the inaugural meeting of the International Socialist Women's Movement in 1907. I cannot make out anyone particularly, but that's an official photograph of their first meeting. And Zetkin is elected as secretary of that movement, and both of these things, as I say, become important to her activity in World War I. And through the Die Gleichheit acts also as a network, and not just for women workers in Germany, but it would also have a regular feature called Aus der Bewegung, which is news from the movement, where basically reports would be sent in from all of the countries where women were organizing in social democratic parties. And as the secretary, Zetkin would collate these, print them in Die Gleichheit. So she's in a favorable position when it comes to World War I in many ways, as having these networks of organizations internationally to work upon, to reunite, as it were, and build upon as the challenge and the dissolution of the Second International unfolds before her eyes. I said that she's in a favorable position, but like many other people at the time, even though she's been polemicizing for a very long time against the threat of war and against the danger that the Social Democrats might line up for that war, when it comes to the collapse of 1914, she says, when the collapse of the Second International came, I thought I would either have to go mad or to kill myself. I was seriously ill for a month and have still not recovered. We also have to take in, and this comes is a very poignant aspect of the letters as well. The letters as a beautiful source of historical inquiry. We have to understand as well that for Zetkin at this time, it's personally a time of trouble. Health is poor. She had TB, I think, in her 20s. Living in exile in Paris. and it's on a personal level, it's bound up with a lot of issues and ailments and all the rest of it for her as well. This is actually from 1915, if I'm April 1915. Anybody know what one hazard a guess as to what the white marks are?
Censorship.
Censorship, exactly. So again, the position that Zetkin is in, she's able to draw upon the links she has. She has, unlike Fleetnet and Luxembourg at this point, she has a publication that she's not only presides over and edits, but has been doing so for a very long time. It's still an official SPD party publication, which also means something, if you think about that, right? It's not it produced independently of the SPD press, and these all put her in a strong position. But there are a number of issues that then arise for her when war breaks out. How do we respond? What do we do? Censorship. So this one, she's described it to a friend, I think Helene Ankersmit in Holland, in the Netherlands, and she says, look, I spent days going through the censor's marks, trying to change everything, and they still weren't happy with what's going on. So she just said, I'll let the white blanks speak their own language. And she tried to do it originally where the people could guess what was in, but it gets more and more difficult as you go on. It's a shame I don't have an earlier one, because the early ones, there are just lines or things missing, like a bad copy. But here you can't, I mean, you'd have to be pretty good to read between the lines on that one, right? So that's one of the challenges that she faces. State of siege. Her house is searched immediately, I think in August 1914. She has a Russian-sounding name, right? Because her first husband, even though they didn't get married, his name, Osip Zetkin, was a Russian. She's accused of hiding spies, of hiding Russians, and she says, "Look, dear police officer, nobody has fought the Tsar with such energy as me for the past 30 years. You have to believe me." She soon finds out that her correspondence is being monitored. So she urges, again, I think it's Ankersmit, she says, look, we have to use coded language. So when we talk about the international, we'll talk about the family. And then if we talk about a wedding or a birthday party, maybe that can refer to a congress or a meeting or something. The other thing that's worth emphasizing is that, as you can probably imagine, this is still an official SPD publication. The SPD party leadership does not kind of sit back and just say, well, you get on with it, Clara. Almost immediately, there is a desubscription campaign launched by the party itself to urge people to scrap their subscriptions. Subsequently, I think 1915, 1916, certain leading trade unions then say, we're going to do our own women's publications, pro-war union publications. And it does affect the readership, as you'd imagine, that the readership numbers do fall as a result of that. And I think it's in the context of all of this, really, that, and maybe it's this idea, this is just conjecture, I can't say this for sure, but in the early weeks and months after the outbreak of World War I, Zetkin seems to imply, as we'll see in a second, that we really need peace, not in a pacifistic way, and I'll go into her position in more detail later on. But really, we need to end this madness, because until we do, there's very little we can actually achieve. She thinks at this point. She doesn't. That's not the position throughout the entire campaign, but that's her position at this point. What is important as well here to emphasize, I don't have this as a picture, but the very last issue of Die Gleichheit, which was produced on August 1st, 1914, runs as a headline the 1907 Stuttgart resolution of the Second International, right, which we heard from Mario Kessler about today, and the amendment famously penned by Lenin, Luxembourg, and Martov. And she runs with that. The censor knocks it out, but that's what she tried to go with. That kind of speaks to her approach. And there was a women's conference planned in Vienna for the autumn of 1914. That obviously had to that fell by the wayside. And we get to this idea now, the initial confusion, the oppression that she feels around her in terms of trying to do anything, trying to write letters, trying to get things done. And we get to this kind of as soon as the war is over idea. Something you probably haven't seen before or heard before is the true nature of Zetkin's response to Luxembourg and Leibniz. So again, Kessler talked about this morning when they meet in Luxembourg's flat. I think it's on the 4th or 5th of August 1914. They send out a telegram to over 300 party functionaries, representatives, people they know. They get one response. And historically, in terms of, until this book essentially came out, so you read in Riddell and others who've spoken about this in Lenin's struggle for a revolutionary international, etc. It's generally been seen that Zetkin was the only responder, but she gave a positive response. But actually, if you go to the correspondence that we now have, we see something quite different. She writes with a heavy heart, she says, but she urges that she urges them to rethink their perspective. What they wanted to do, they wanted to initiate very quickly some kind of public protest action against the party leadership and against the Reichstag faction, right, to get things going. And she said, I'm sorry if I want to be, if I sound a bit of a disappointment, but I must express my views forthrightly. And she says, it's too early. And I'll show the quote in a second. She's actually, even though she's the only one to respond, it's not really the response they were looking for at that time. So and in terms of her personal and political position as well, she's in a strange one because she's got her editorial duties. She's still a member of the press commission in Württemberg, in Stuttgart, where she lives. And she's still a member and still goes to the national meeting. I think there's only one, but she goes to the national meeting of the Kontrollkommission is what it's called. So it's kind of like the monitoring body of the party, like disciplinary body, which must have been really interested in August 1914, going to that and seeing how that works. So she's still doing her party duties. She wants to do something different, but at this point in time, she urges, hang on, we need to think about this. And this is how she explains it. This is the as soon as war is over idea. The protest that Leibniz and Luxembourg and Meerving and others actually had come up with. He says, the protest changes nothing when it comes to the parliamentary fraction's stance. It will remain a purely personal demonstration that nobody would understand and that would only demonstrate how isolated we are, how small and powerless we are. Oh, if only you knew how difficult it is for me to preach to you about cool reason. In doing so, I fear that I might lose your friendship and respect. So again, this is all new stuff. It just shows in the early months her reaction. Maybe it feeds into this idea that was prevalent, certainly in propaganda circles, that the war will be a quick one, right? That it'll be over relatively soon. Who knows? But that's certainly it kind of in a nutshell, her response. As soon as the war is over, she says, I will be prepared to join you in proclaiming a declaration of war. So she doesn't mention it, in proclaiming a declaration of war on the party or leaving it altogether. Remember what I talked about with fulfilling her SPD party duties, alongside a thorough explanation of why I'm doing so. Such a move will then find support and a following and have a political impact. Right? And it's a theme in Zetkin, not just in terms of this presentation today in 1914 and 1918, but actually, I'm not saying she's right here, but it's a strength of hers generally. She's always aware of we need to speak to the masses. It's the masses that count, right? We need to get across our message clearly to the masses, and we'll refer to that. So that leads to all sorts of issues, for example, with the KPD in the third period, etc. Again, that was buried for a long time. That's a side note for now. One initial, this is later on in August. She does go along with one action that's initiated by the guys in Berlin, so Luxembourg and Leibniz, signed by the big four here, so Zetkin, Luxembourg, Meerving, Leibniz. And this was in response to the SPD party leadership, represented by Albert Zudukum and Richard Fischer, going to the press of the neutral countries and putting across their case for why we're supporting the war, why it's necessary to do so, etc., etc. And they send in their own letter in response in Sweden, Italy, and Switzerland. But the funny thing that it's very guarded. What it says is we see things differently. So he said, we note that these comrades have put across, then they call them comrades. These comrades have put across their view in the press. We, however, see things differently. And she said, they say in the letter, for the time being, the state of siege makes it impossible for us to represent our views in public. So again, you see that there is an action now, but it's still very guarded and cautious. By the way, just going backwards, that's a drawing as a sketch by her. You can see N. Bukharin, I think it's one of the commenters. It's a drawing by Nikolai Bukharin, who maybe we'll talk about later, but a close ally of Zetkin's later on in and against Stalin. But so I kind of painted a slightly negative picture, I suppose, so far. But we see that initial confusion. I think we see that initial worry about what would be the potential shortcomings of launching an aggressive party action and going public. And these are kind of discussions that go on throughout the war in the Spartacus League. What are the best tactics? How do we get our message across in the most effective way? Where, as I said earlier, where Zetkin is different and why she's so important in the history of the Spartacus League and in the struggle against war is that she has the International Socialist Women's Movement and still the pages of Die Gleichheit, albeit produced under the state of siege and censorship, etc. And so she then goes ahead and says towards the end of 1914, I am going to organize a conference of socialist women. And she says, I'm going to formulate it in such vague terms that pretty much everyone can come along. She says, I want all of the female sections of the Socialist Women's International, the Socialist International, to be represented, and I want a big discussion. A brief aside here, I suppose, about one of the things that annoys me about the literature on Zetkin, and there's not a lot in English in terms of books, there's quite a lot in German. And one of the things you see with Zetkin is that she was all these amazing things. She was a pacifist, she was a feminist, she was a socialist, she was an internationalist, she was, add your list, and you think, you're missing the point slightly here. But what's interesting about so I talked about her foregrounding piece. And she thinks that the peace question, really peace must be established if the international is to be able to get itself together again and overcome the betrayals and get moving again. But it wasn't a position of pacifism. Does that make sense? So she says that we need war against this war. The war needs to come to an end. It's an imperialist war. But fundamentally, in her immediate response is, we will struggle to produce anything valuable if we don't achieve that peace. So that sometimes then you get the pacifist thing. Gilbert Bader, Féministes sans frontières, his book from the 90s, it's translated into German, I don't know French. He basically says that while Zetkin has been seen as an anti-feminist, etc., in World War I, feminist tones can be far more clearly seen. I think this is problematic, but I just wanted to raise it as an idea because what you get in Zetkin is quite true. For the first time, you see this idea of we women have the duty to this. It's up to us. We are the power, etc. When the men kill, it is up to women to fight to preserve life. If the men are silent, then it's our duty to raise our voices. And for people like Bader, this is evidence of a kind of feminist turn in Zetkin, or a stronger expression of the feminism that he finds throughout the career, which I think I've spoken about before, doesn't make sense at all. I think and I get this, trying to get this across with the picture, the context is surely decisive here as well, because the men, largely speaking, are either drawn into the front, or they're dying, being killed, etc. And women, really, it's not that they do this for the first time, because women have been working in industry in Germany for a long time, but they're drawn into the arms industry, etc. And I've got some pictures of that there. And it should be stressed as well that the continuity, Zetkin always distinguished between the proletarian women's movement and the kind of bourgeois women's rights feminist movement. And that's something that informs her approach to her response to World War I as well. So she's very critical of kind of the pacifist do-gooders, women having their own women's conferences, getting together. And she says, we need to fight these people. That's why we need our own conferences. So towards the end of 1914, she draws up this appeal to convene the conference. Field of Bern, Switzerland, March 1915, 3 days in Switzerland, 25 delegates. And it should be, I should say as well, that this comes at a time, this idea of we the women, we must take action, we must step forward. It does come at a time when there is a kind of shift on the home front, and you are seeing various demonstrations in various countries. I concentrate mainly on Germany, largely led by women against the effects of the war at that early stage. So inflation, etc., is a big demonstration outside of the Gleichheit in March 1915, and subsequent demonstrations as well. Represented Brits, Germans, Russians. The French and German delegates are unofficial ones, for obvious reasons. And it's here that we come to Zetkin's, again, lots of letters about this, Zetkin's relationship with another significant socialist woman called Louisa Zetkin. There was once called Sleepy Zetkin by Zinoviev. She in that book, actually. She became a USPD rightist, but in 1914, she's actually on the party leadership, but she's critical of the war, and she's corresponding with Zetkin. And the party leadership come down hard, as you can imagine, on Zetkin. Who's authorized this conference? You do not have them. She says, well, I'm the secretary of the International Socialist Women's Movement. Thank you very much. And Louisa will vouch for me. Louisa Zetkin kind of caves in at this point, and that leads to Zetkin calling her all sorts of things, colorful language you can read about in the letters. They do kind of, they are reconciled later on. But Zetkin at this point is pretty pissed off with the role that Zetkin played, because, to say, she was opposed to the war, but kind of caved into the pressures of the SPD leadership. That's an excerpt from the manifesto that was agreed in Bern, which is basically, as a conference, I mean, we all probably know what the Zimmerwald movement is, right? The trend, the various trends of that. And if not, I can ask questions, I can go into that a little bit more. But at this women's conference, the kind of three shades of opinion, or the three trends that you start to see emerge in the movement against the war are on evidence there. And so you have kind of the right wing, which is led by some of the British delegates and others who are very much for pacifist, purely pacifist means of struggle and an understanding of the war. So they say they locate the problem as being war itself. War is the problem. Whereas then you have the kind of more Zimmerwald approach, which is represented by Zetkin and the majority here. Which is, capitalism is the problem, capitalist imperialism the problem. War has emerged from that. We need to struggle against this with war as best we can. We need to organize the international again. And then you have the left Zimmerwald, very much the early stages of it now, with Lenin actually is in a cafe. So you can still go, I don't know if anyone's been to Bern, but you can still go to the Berner Volkshaus. That's where they had this meeting. And it's very nice, apparently, with the roof terrace and everything. But Lenin's sat around a corner in a cafe, and because he's living in Switzerland at the time, he's in exile with Zinoviev and others. And the Bolshevik delegation is represented by Ines Armand. And there's a controversy at the thing. So they've got this statement worked out pretty much, and there's been some issues about whether we should call for civil war. Whether we should call for a new international. Those are the two of the main demands of the Bolshevik delegation, represented by Armand. And the majority goes along with Zetkin, who oppose both of those things, right? But they nonetheless have a declaration. You can see, the war against war, women, where are your husbands, where are your sons? You have to do, this is war of capitalist imperialism, war against this war. Armand, apparently, it depends who you believe. So Balabanov, who was a very important figure in the Zimmerwald movement and in this conference as well, very much later on, like 30, 40 years later, writes this, I can't remember what it's called. It's a long extended essay on Lenin. Lenin or the ends justify the means. That's what it's called. I just came back to it. And she says that, Armand and all, that they're constantly going back to Lenin in this cafe. So, is this right? Is this wrong? So it's a bit, it's one of those stories in history, how, to what extent is it true as Balabanov puts it. But I think, largely speaking, that's what happened. And then there's a kind of standoff. So there's this amicable conference, good discussions. I've read the protocol. It does, again, would be nice to have that in English. And Zetkin is kind of leading the thing, as you would probably imagine, given her authority, given her experience. And then the Bolshevik delegation say, we're not going to vote for this because it's not a principle. It only goes halfway. And the meeting ends. And there's, again, it depends who you read and the account, but some say that the Bolshevik delegation just met with Zetkin and they kind of ironed it out. Well, they didn't iron out, I'll come to what they did. And some say that Zetkin and Lenin had a quick chat, maybe in the cafe around the corner. But whatever exactly happened, I'm not sure. They agreed that the Bolshevik delegation, they would go along with the statement as it was. They would vote for it as long as their documents, the resolution that they presented would be published with the documents. And according to Craig Nation, which is, I don't know if you know Craig Nation's book, it's a good book on some about leftists, an academic book, but it's a decent one. He says that this really reflected the approach of the Bolsheviks at the time. They were kind of feeling out where their forces were. So they wanted to present a line, but they didn't want to split really, but they wanted to see where things were at and test what was going on. But as I said, they did have big differences still with Zetkin at this point. So Lenin says, for example, these are catch-all phrases and commonplaces, I think is the term he uses. It's just this kind of fluffy rhetoric. It doesn't really get down to what needs to be done to break with the forces of the Second International, also break with the centre, and so on. Ebert dismissed it as I describe this as a hen do with coffee. It's a Kränzchen, Kränzchen. Hen do with coffee, is that a fair translation? Because hen do's in Britain that people tend to go on the piss, but in Germany it's kind of coffee and cake. So Ebert says this is just a bunch of old women sat around having a cup of coffee and caffeine and sugar and getting all excited. But you see that was he was incredibly dismissive of it. You would expect that. And many historians, Horst Lademacher is probably the key guy. He's the one who put together all the documents of this and the protocols and everything. A German historian, and he says, look, this must have been a failure on some level because 25 people, it's not really, but I think looking back, I think that the symbolism of it is quite clear, and I think that despite the differences, the manifesto was actually not a bad one for the state at the time in 1915. So Zetkin returns to Germany and distributes this flyer as a flyer. The manifesto is arrested, which leads to more trouble for her on a personal level. And it soon becomes clear that the authorities say that she's actually not fit to be in prison. She's just too old and too ill. That doesn't stop them demanding quite a lot of money from the SPD, which the SPD does step in and pay the money to get her released. But yeah, I just wanted there's a point here as well on the personal level and illegality. It should be stressed, comrades might not be aware of this, that Zetkin as a politician, she learned her Marxism, she developed as a politician in Switzerland during the anti-socialist wars. So she was, Julius Mottler, the Red Postal Service, where they would illegally bring in the party newspaper back into Germany from Switzerland. She was heavily involved in that movement. So she's used to this state of illegality or semi-illegality. But as I say, it's spanned up with a lot of issues for her. One little thing I noticed as well in the letters and in the secondary literature is when she's on trial, and one of her biographers, Barder, the same guy I referred to recently, I think he makes a good point. He said she wasn't necessarily the best at defending herself in the trial, because she said she actually got up at one point and said, look, I don't want civil war. I voted against the Bolshevik government. And then apparently they got a lawyer in then to help her, because it didn't seem she was doing particularly well on the stand. But anyway, long story short, she was released, and the party had to pay a bail. The Spartacus letters, Spartacus Briefe. The first thing to be said here. So we're moving on to 1916 now. There was, Mario mentioned this morning, the foundation of the Internationale Group, Luxembourg and others in 1914. They had one edition of their newspaper produced, 5,000, a run of 5,000 apparently, which again, just think of the numbers here, and it's very small. But they were soon clamped down upon and arrested. So they switched to the Spartacus letters, which were effectively an illegal publication that they managed to use networks essentially to get out. And the Spartacus grouping is founded in late 1915, early 1916. The German far left, for some reason, has a habit of doing conferences on New Year's Eve. So they start the new year as the kind of it's maybe a nice thing to do. The KGB was the same, and they. as a result of the foundation of this new grouping, the new publication, they produce a number of Leitsätze, or kind of guiding principles that are written by Rosa Luxemburg. And they're really worth looking at in some detail. It also leads to discussion I mentioned earlier on in an intervention between Lenin and the Germans on various questions, and the Junius pamphlet which we'll talk about. But the two things that are worth mentioning here, it's very small, but you can see it says the focus of the class organization of the proletariat is to be found in the International. It's 1915, 1916. So you get, at this time as well, you start to get sound, you start to hear things and read things about the need for a new international. The second one's collapsed. We need something new, right? But the question is how to achieve that and where to go. And so you've got number 3 there. That's from the guidelines written by Luxemburg. Number 4 says the duty to carry out the decisions of the international. Remember the 1907 Stuttgart Resolution votes. What's it said? Are more important, should be a priority over all other organizational questions. Right, that should be the dominant thing, is that we should be looking in our politics, etc., to enact what we said, and that's something worth these bigger debates, broader discussions about the Second International, revolutionary social democracy. Was it just kind of everything binned and then something new really pulled up, because they were trying to raise these points. I think I see it facing both ways. There is a sense in which I think there are differences. I must admit I haven't got to the point yet where I can start to pinpoint them, but I think Zetkin is an influence here. In Lenin's eminently readable critique of the Junius brochure, which is Luxemburg's explanation of the war, that kind of comes before these Leitsätze, before these guidelines, Lenin says, well, I have a feeling, I'm not sure, but I have a feeling that in the Spartacus group, there are some people who still do not want to break with the center. And, you can see, I think you can see that in some of their propaganda as well. They are facing both ways. It's not that I'm not trying to denigrate it. It's good stuff what they're writing in very difficult conditions, but you can see some of these tensions. And as I say, only now with the correspondence, you get a more rounded impression of it. And I think Zetkin was perhaps a force for caution in this group. And I think if you think about the people involved in it, that makes sense for some of the reasons I'm involved, because she's got this, she's worried about her position, how to get across her ideas and her own situation. Lenin, the issues that Lenin raises with the Spartacus League are the building of an illegal apparatus in Germany. De facto, that's actually happening, as I alluded to with the Spartacus, the call for a new cleansed international, the call to turn war into civil war. And the latter two you certainly don't see until later on. You may have seen it coming, but in 1917, Zetkin is removed from the Gleichheit after all this pressure that she was put under. She's trying to kind of keep her post, as it were, in this time, in the state of siege. And the party leadership basically turn around and, well, they basically just come in and change the locks and throw her out and in everything. But obviously she doesn't take that lying down. She fights back and organizes her forces as well. But the pretext, and it's not just Zetkin that's affected by this, it's also people like Karl Kautsky as editor of the Neue Zeit. The pretext is that in 1917, following tensions within the SPD Reichstag fraction and people voting against war credits, there's a de facto independent group, the Socialist Working Group, it's called in the party fraction, that becomes what we know as the USPD, and the Spartacus League join that as an organization. Yeah, that basically, they say this is now you put yourself in a position where you're no longer compatible with the SPD and you're out. One question that you might be thinking is, why was this not banned outright? Because there were left-wing organizations and newspapers that were banned altogether. And one thing I found again in Bader's book is that there was some information passed from the Censorship Bureau that said that they actually feared the repercussions of banning it outright. I'm not quite sure that whether that was a correct assessment of the situation, but that information came when Zetkin was in prison. I think they're kind of being slightly guarded just because of the possible ramification for a publication that was so well read and respected. This also coincided with Zetkin's 60th birthday, and there's all these letters sent into the newspaper we'll look at in a second. She says, your warm greetings act as a form of protest against the party leadership. So there's kind of flood of support for her. In the USPD, the Leipziger Volkszeitung, I waved that around earlier on, Leipziger Volkszeitung, again, Leipzig was a stronghold of the left in Germany. If a lot of the stuff that you've read by Rosa Luxemburg, for example, some of her articles would have been printed in the Leipziger Volkszeitung, particularly on the mass strike. So, you know, the mass strike debate where Kautsky says, no, I've had enough now. I don't want you writing all these stuff. She goes off and writes in the Leipziger Volkszeitung. So it was a local party newspaper, but it did have a reach beyond Leipzig, beyond Germany, and certainly in Russia and places. She takes on the editorial work for the Frauenbeilage, which is the women's supplement, and you see there it says with constant editorial input from Clara Zetkin. So she, again, that is very much, you can see that, and this happens in the German Revolution as well. They want Clara Zetkin's name because she is known and she's got connections. So that's they put that on the front of it. Mehring apparently arranges for that to happen, and the first edition is in June 1917, and so in the correspondence it becomes clear that Zetkin is worried about. She thinks that the USPD comrades are dragging their feet a little bit, that they don't actually really trust her with this either, and that maybe it had been a mistake. So that's that becomes clear in the correspondence. What's worth emphasizing as well is this whole idea of breaks and continuities. From a kind of cursory look, I've got 37 of these, as I say, now looking through them, they have a very similar structure and approach to Die Gleichheit. In many ways, it looks like if you change the titles, it would be the same paper in many ways. You have the lead article, which is usually written by Zetkin as a kind of commentary on what's going on. And then lots of international news pieces. Again, Zetkin's collecting all this correspondence from Amman, Kollontai, etc., Ankersmit in Holland, the Danes, etc., and putting it all into the newspaper as a way of still organizing the forces against World War I. And the third international call, this may be slightly earlier, but the earliest one I found so far in my digging is May 1917. It's worth quoting in full. Am I correct? 2 more minutes? 15. Okay, that's, yeah, I'll be done. And this is from a May Day pamphlet, I think, a May Day flyer. So it's the second international, which was supposed to bring together and provide leadership to the great historical life that was stirring among the workers and oppressed of all countries, disgracefully collapsed as a victim of capitalist, imperialism, even before the proletarians dressed in uniforms of various colors had exchanged deadly fire. The International's leading body, the International Socialist Bureau, had proved incapable of even viewing or evaluating the unfolding events correctly, let alone of leading. In France and Germany, the decisive states, the official social democracy stood behind the imperialism of the property class. All attempts to use the apparatus of the International Socialist Bureau to galvanize the international of the proletariat have failed. So I think from that, you see a slight development in approach, right? Because the background would be the International Socialist Bureau. We've still got people on there. We still can move things. We obviously we have to fight these bastards that are leading these politics, but we might be able to do something if we can reorientate the politics a bit. But here, I think it's also the frustration of the International Socialist Bureau failing to get anything together in any reason. We'll look at Stockholm in a second. That informs this. Also, the influence of Russia, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And she said, yet the international proletariat is not dead and cannot die. It is the everlasting honor of the socialist women that they played a part in the first activities to establish the third socialist and international. So clearer politics, clearer texture in terms of what she's saying, I think. And she always will look back and reflect upon Bern as this reflecting this, this kind of gear change in gear shift in the organization force. And then just quickly going back a month to the founding Congress of the USPD in Gotha in April 1917, she says, may your Congress do justice to the great historical deed of the Russian revolutionaries. So it's worth stressing is here, but the great thing about letters is that you see a much more rounded, you get a much more rounded view of people and how they're approaching politics, their own personal struggles and the things they're thinking about. And there are elements of kind of despair in the letters, as you would also expect. You know, at one point she's like, these fucking Germans, you know, they will not do anything until a leader tells them to do something. She's like word for word, they will not do anything, you know, because she's just so frustrated with how slow things are in Germany. And there's a certain romantic element of it, perhaps. And, you know, I said I've talked about her links with Russia, but at one point she says, everything draws me to Russia, right? So as 1917 unfolds, still in the early days, not yet at the Bolshevik of power, but the February Revolution, etc. She's drawn to Russia as this is the chance, really. This can really change the game. And then we come to Stockholm, the Two Souls of Stockholm. This is quite complicated if you don't know your Zimmerwald and all the rest of it. Again, Craig Nation's a good book to read. But in 1917, not least because of the Russian Revolution, this is the Petrograd Soviet under Menshevik leadership, basically put out a call with the what's it called again, the Dutch Scandinavian Peace Committee to finally get some kind of second international peace conference together as soon as possible. This is kind of spring, summer 1917. And there's a really important and I think interesting and revealing discussion here between Zetkin and Mehring. And I think Mehring speaks for probably the majority of the Spartacus League, which we'll come to. But you've got the ISB, Old Second International on the one hand, and the ISC, the Zimmerwalders, who are led at this point by Robert Grimm, although he's about to disgrace himself in the Grimm-Hoffmann affair, but again, I can go into that if you want to. And Balabanov, and they also want to have their own Zimmerwald-based, free of the social chauvinist conference, right, in Stockholm. Before we get onto this view, I should say that it's kind of a moot one on one level because the ISB does not actually manage to get the conference together again. So there's been 3 years of this. But the question is, so if you think about this, this is the official Social Democrats that have sold out, that have gone along with the war credits, that have told workers it's fine to kill each other in times of war and all the rest of it. The question that comes up, not just for the Zimmerwaldists, but then for people like Zetkin and the Spartacus group, is how do we respond? Do we just boycott it? So, for example, this correspondence with Kollontai says why would we bother going to this Stockholm strike conference? So imagine that it did come together, it never did, but why would we bother? It's a complete waste of time. These people are hypocrites, etc. And that's also the line of Mehring and others. And Zetkin writes, I think, a letter that's very revealing of her as a personality, as an individual, and as a politician. And I think it's what proves to be one of her strengths, actually, even though I think she's probably mistaken in her judgment at the time. She says to Mehring, I'm very disappointed with the attitude that you've taken by rejecting this conference outright, right? So I have no illusions that going to sit in a room with all these people, these scumbags who've sold us out, etc. But we need to earn, we need to win. Where are the masses looking? The people will be following this conference if it comes together. We need to be on record as saying, you're traitors, you're scumbags, we need to be in their faces, right? And she says, I will go on my knees if needed, even if I arrive as a corpse. She has a slightly dramatic element in her thing. She says, no, if needs be, I'll crawl to Stockholm. It's very important that we have a delegation at both the Stockholm ISB and the Stockholm Zimmerwald ISC conference. And like I say, that to me is a letter that in some ways summarizes Zetkin's approach. It's always about where are the masses looking, how do we gain their ear, how do we stand on a principled stance. And I won't go into the misunderstandings, but one of the funny things you see as well is that she's trying to arrange things because she's ill and she can't, the other thing I should have said, she can't travel either. So she's trying to pull these strings from Stuttgart. And the Dutch comrade, she's got a very good close comrade, Helene Agnesmith, and she says, we need to be at Stockholm. So, so we're going to have a women's conference. No, I didn't really need a women's conference. They got to go back and forward on this, and it kind of adds to the confusion, the political confusion that exists on this, how to respond to the Stockholm conferences. I've talked about the aspects of despair. the personal tragedy continues as well. So not only do you have her health worries, but you've got then comrades in and out of prison, right? So the Liebknecht and Luxembourg are two obvious ones. And her husband is a volunteer, excuse me, for the Red Cross this time. He's a driver. So he's in this kind of position where he can drive out to the farms and see if they got any butter or fat or anything. So she's like she's sending fat to Sonia Liebknecht to take to Karl Liebknecht and things like that. And you see how she's trying to struggle through this. And also her third son, Hans Diefenbach, dies, and she's absolutely distraught by that. Is a very close comrade of the Spartacists, and she gets all these letters about it, like, we're so sorry. It's almost like his mother. And she gets a letter from Louisa Kautsky, old long-standing friend, obviously frosty relations since about 1910, certainly since 1914. And telling me, she says, say hello to the boys from me. The boys being Carl and Louisa's three sons, not to Carl himself. But yeah, they said there's a lot of struggles for Clara, and she's thinking, let's not get ourselves down. Let's think of Russia. So Russia becomes increasingly this force that she's drawn to, and that's, by the way, that's the publication she would later edit, which is the Female Communist or the Woman Communist. It says forwards with Soviet Russia, right? And yeah, that's a decision that really takes it is a kind of new stage in her career, I suppose. Also in the USPD, there's two things to be said about her role in the USPD. The first one is that you may know, or you'll be certainly aware of, Kautsky's writings on the October Revolution, and Luxembourg's little prison pamphlet, The Russian Revolution. The context, and I didn't know this either, but the context of that is what is so-called Russia debate in the USPD. So in the course of 1917, there's this huge debate within the USPD. Martov, Kautsky, Luxembourg, Zetkin, some Russians, some other Russians as well. And this is interesting for a number of reasons, but she writes because again, she can't attend the particular USPD Congress for health reasons. So she writes a private letter to this Congress. She writes a letter that's read out at the Congress, and we've now got that. And where she basically draws a balance sheet of the ongoing events in Russia, the October Revolution, what it means, its significance, etc. And one of the reasons that it stands out is that it's clear that in her selected speeches and writings, which was produced under the GDR leadership, that whole passages of that were just cut without comment. So anything, it's not like she's ripping on the Bolshevik approach or the October Revolution. She's absolutely along with it, but she does make some critical comments here and there about the relationships to other socialist parties, etc. But they were all just cut without comment, and even some of the words were changed from kind of civil war to fraternal war to civil war, etc. Little things like that, and that really is something that says kind of put a cloud over our understanding of Zetkin to this day, and it's now good that we can go back and see them. The other thing about the USPD to be mentioned, of course, is that she, unlike Liebknecht, again, differences with Liebknecht and Luxembourg, she does not think it's a good idea to leave the USPD when they do. And again, it reflects this idea that I brought out in terms of, where are people's heads at? Where are they looking to? Where are they organized? She was all for a Communist Party. She joined the Communist Party later on, but she was a USPD state deputy, a parliamentarian, the first woman to speak in a German parliament, and so she was very wary of this idea that we split at this time, so we need more time in the USPD, and events would kind of play out and vindicate her on that, I think. And yeah, I think I'll probably draw it to a close there, but I just wanted to just say that the Russian thing, the whole question of censorship as well, we get in the correspondence and other things now that's come through. It's clear that Zetkin she was clearly tied to the Soviet Union. She was also tied to the idea of socialism in one country. She was tied ultimately until the death to the idea, fundamentally to the idea of socialism in one country. She supported the expulsion of Trotsky, for example. You can read that in English. But she did not like Stalin. Stalin did not like her. She was close to Bukharin, I think, and the right opposition, also in the KPD. It becomes clear that, again, despite all the attempts of the GDR to present a kind of unified picture, she was extremely critical of the KPD on the third period, on fascism. She thought Tailman was an idiot. And you see that in the letters. She said the problem with the KPD is that nobody's got theoretical training. Tailman just wakes up one day and does what he wants. And obviously Tailman was the guy, the Soviet guy in the German Communist Party. And she's kind of removing, and there's a, I don't want to end on a sad note after all this bravery and struggling against war, but there's a kind of tragic kind of denouement to her life in a sense, because she's ill, she's isolated, she is unable to influence the KPD as she would like to. She speaks out in her letters. She's relatively forthright in some of her letters, but the opposition to Stalin, etc., is very much between the lines. So, for example, she would be speaking at a big party event in Moscow, say into the early 30s, and would quote Marx and Engels 4 times, Lenin twice, Stalin once. And it's that kind of sad. No, you laughed about it, but it's that kind of sad denouement to it all. And I did find something the other day when I was in the archives. Maybe I should end on that, but I won't end on that because it'd be sad. Bukharin says that Bukharin recalls her last meeting with Lenin before Lenin died, and Bukharin mentions how Zetkin famously kisses his hands before she departs, and then Stalin later says the old witch kissed Lenin's hand, and the old witch was also what Kaiser Wilhelm II called Zetkin's body the most dangerous witch in the Second Empire, we once said. But no, just to wrap all that, I'm sorry if it's been a little bit bitty and here and there, but I think the taking more of a kind of broad, or stepping away from all this new material, I suppose, is that what is significant about Zetkin is this idea, the embodiment of something significant in that move from the Second to the Third International. Whatever her failings in, the later failings and the kind of traps and boxes she got herself into in Soviet Russia, revolutionary social democracy, she is perhaps the most significant figure. We talk about Liebknecht and Luxemburg, but a figure with such a following, with such respect, that was able to take and embody and take with her thousands upon thousands of revolutionary workers following the collapse of 1914 and into a new international. I think that's worth emphasizing. Really, that's only really the true extent of that, or the true import of that, is only something that's becoming clear now with all this new material. So I'll stop there. Thank you.